So one of my favorite things is when I get emails from people who disagree with me, but have a genuine kind of question or argument they want to make. That's very different than when people just kind of email to say, what an asshole I am. But people who have like a genuine argument that they want to hear responded to. And I got an email like that the other day. And it was kind of in the wake of these demonstrations in Iran, and the person said about progressives, he said, quote, "I often see intense focus on Israel without proportional attention to severe human rights violations in Iran, China, Russia, and elsewhere." And it's a really, really important point, I think, to answer. And it's a debate that's been going on for a long time. And his question reminded me of this remarkable video, this remarkable clip of a conversation decades ago between Noam Chomsky and David Frum. Chomsky and Frum, of course, both much younger at that time. David Frum was quite a young man, but still it appears to be having some of the kind of hawkish tendencies that he became later well known for. And in their interaction, Frum says, that when we think about how what we focus on as Americans in terms of our foreign policy concerns, Frum says there should be, quote, an equality of corpses, by which he means we should treat all deaths in which people are killed by a regime equally, irrespective of irrespective of who does it. And Chomsky argues no. Chomsky says, actually, we should care more about those deaths that are committed with American participation, with American complicity. Not, of course, because the lives matter more, but simply because we have a greater moral obligation because we participated in their killing. And Chomsky says, quote, "It's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions." And I think this is something that we kind of intuitively kind of understand if we take it out of the realm of foreign policy and just think about interpersonal interactions, right? I mean, if I am, God forbid, beating up on someone, I have a greater responsibility to stop doing so than I do to stop my neighbor who is beating up on someone. Partly, again, because I am the one who's committing this despicable action. It's also just as a practical matter, a lot easier for me to stop that action than to stop the neighbor, right? Again, I may well also have an obligation to do something about what my neighbor is doing. But if I do, but it's a much more complicated business. I have to literally go, what am I going to go kind of fight my neighbor to make sure my neighbor is not fighting against the other person? That might well be a valuable thing to do. But in the hierarchy of things that I should do, if I have a limited amount of time, the first thing I should do is to make sure that I am not beating up on anybody. And Chomsky cites the great Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov as an example. It's a really, really interesting point to make because for Sakharov is rightly was a hero to hawks in the United States, right? Hawks in the United States who loved to talk about the Soviet Union's human rights abuses, but didn't like to talk about the human rights abuses that the United States was complicit in all around the world during the Cold War. And Chomsky kind of turns it around and says, if you notice, Andrei Sakharov is not talking about America's human rights abuses. He's talking about the human rights abuses in the Soviet Union because they're the ones that he is complicit in, right? And so he's saying Sakharov should be a model for us, which is that Sakharov focuses on the human rights abuses that he, as a Soviet citizen, is responsible for because he, through his tax dollars, is paying for them. Again, none of this is to say that we should not care about people who are being killed, brutalized in Xinjiang under Chinese, what the U.S. has called genocide in China, or Russians suffering under Vladimir Putin, or certainly these very brave Iranians who are risking their lives to overthrow this horrifying regime. We should care about them deeply, and to the degree that we can do something positive in accordance with our best understanding of what they want us to do, we should do that. But if the question is it wrong to focus more attention on what Israel has done in Gaza than what Iran is doing to its own people. The Chomsky's answer, which I find convincing, is yes, it is morally justifiable because Israel's crimes are being committed with American weapons. And the Iranian regime's crimes are not being committed with my tax dollars. And so there is a clear moral argument. All human beings' lives are equally valuable. All tyranny is equally wrong. But when you think about what you can do, Chomsky's argument, which is that you should focus first on the things that you as an individual, because of the country in which you live, are responsible for because you were paying for them. I think that argument is convincing. And I think it's important to distinguish that argument from the argument that defends human rights abusing regimes just because they're anti-American. I have no sympathy for that kind of apologia whatsoever. But that kind of apologia, which denies terrible human rights abuses in Iran or China or Russia or Venezuela, is fundamentally different from an argument that says all human rights abuses are horrendous, but it is ethically understandable that we would focus first and foremost on those human rights abuses for which we are personally responsible.